Chocolate's not-so-sweet secret. The bitter truth of cocoa production. The dark realities of our beloved dopamine-triggering beans. Have I got your interest? Good. Because today we're going to be talking about one of the most controversial issues that has consistently haunted the chocolate industry for decades. Or at least, sort of talk about it. The issue that I'm referring to being that of child labor that is seemingly endemic to the aforementioned industry, which, rightfully so, has triggered a series of human rights groups to raise awareness about the less glamorous aspects of our beloved food and drink staple. So far so good, right? I mean, child labor is obviously a disgusting and reprehensible act, and any person or corporation that participates in it, whether tacitly or overtly, deserves nothing less than widespread condemnation and persecution. But there's a but. Or at least sort of, because regardless of all the documentaries and news reports and press releases that we read related to the issue, the truth is that this problem is actually a lot more intricate than we're often led to believe. Which means that taking necessary steps towards rectifying it requires a generally better understanding of its nuance and root causes. But before delving into that, let's just take one step back and ask ourselves, what exactly is child labor? Now, for a lot of people, this term is likely to conjure up images of children kidnapped from their homes by criminals and trafficked around the world whilst being forced to perform jobs that no child has any place performing. Something that we can all agree to be infinitely vile, disgusting, and evil. So much so that the worst forms of child labor convention, adopted by the International Labour Organization, became the first convention of its kind to be universally ratified by all member states, some 187 countries. However, although this form of child labor is unfortunately a very real thing, it in truth only constitutes a single infraction amongst the wider child labor phenomenon. You see, as per the official definition of the ILO, child labor constitutes work that deprives children of their childhood, their potential, and their dignity. A definition which is evidently a lot more broad than the aforementioned concept, which, in truth, is not what child labor usually looks like. Outside of Hollywood, that is, as exploiters are usually not hardened criminals, but instead people of trust within a child's life who, in some manner, compel them to perform labor during times where they should otherwise be playing or at school. This principle being reflected even in the aforementioned convention itself, which broadens the definition of child labor beyond strictly trafficking. So far so good, right? I mean, we have a working definition of child labor, a universally ratified treaty geared towards combating it, and as a result, the means for doing so. Well, yes, but just take a look at this. This is Article 3D of the aforementioned convention, where child labor is described as work which by its nature or the circumstances in which it is carried out is likely to harm the health, safety, or morals of children. A noticeably vague statement which in Article 4 is expanded upon as follows. The types of work referred to under Article 3D shall be determined by national laws or regulations or by the competent authority, which essentially means that each member state is allowed its own sovereign determination of what constitutes child labor. Which may seem to be a little bit odd. I mean, considering that the ILO itself provides a working definition of child labor, this caveat may seem to be somewhat of a glaring loophole. Perhaps to those a little more conspiratorially minded, even an intentional one. This situation leading many lobby groups and journalistic outlets to attempt to fill in the gaps of what they see to be a shortcoming from the ILO's end. And the results of said initiatives? Absolute failure that has seen little to no dent in the prevalence of child labor, especially within the main area of focus, sub-Saharan Africa. You see, according to ILO statistics, as much as 160 million children worldwide are engaged in child labor, of which the bulk of the share, about half, stem from sub-Saharan Africa, a concerning statistic that has led the bulk of the anti-child labor initiative to be focused within said areas. Which is understandable. I mean, that is literally what the statistics say. So, in light of this, one would assume that focusing on the most problematic area would yield the most optimal results. Which is probably true, but only if done properly, which, as per recent literature on the subject, seems to be anything but the case. And what's to blame for this issue? Well, so let's just do a little bit of an experiment right now. Just jump into Google and type in the most evil companies in the world. Now just scroll around a little and jump into whatever link piques your interest. Read all entries and tell me, is Nestle on this list? I'm gonna venture a guess and say that it is. And the reasons for this are numerous, believe me, but foremost amongst them is the issue of child labor. A controversy that Nestle seems to find itself embroiled within again and again and again and again. Though on the bright side for them, they are amongst distinguished company, as other conglomerations involved in cocoa extraction find themselves subject to similar controversies. The chocolate industry, keeping it classy as always. And what are the ramifications of these controversies? Well, of course, outrage, which, whilst positive in its intention, can nonetheless be a little bit of a double-edged sword, due to what I like to refer to as the cult of outrage. You see, we as adults are almost naturally inclined to have a very visceral and emotional reaction to the idea of the exploitation of children. And in this sense, the idea of chocolate that we love so much utilizing child labor for its extraction is the perfect recipe for an emotional outrage cocktail, which is justified but not necessarily effective on a legislative level. Because whilst problems in the chocolate industry are bound to make sensationalistic headlines, they in truth should far from be the model case to base anti-child labor legislation upon. And to properly understand why, let's just look at the case study of Ghana. Located on the western end of sub-Saharan Africa and with an abundant cocoa industry and high child labor numbers, the nation, alongside neighboring countries like Cote d'Ivoire, has often found itself at the forefront of a series of controversies related to child labor in cocoa production. This in turn leading the nation to become a strong area of focus for anti-child labor campaigners, said advocates, many of which being Western-backed and funded, garnering so much influence in Ghana throughout the 1990s that it in part ultimately culminated in Ghana's 2005 Human Trafficking Act, a hard-lined anti-trafficking legal framework that encapsulates the child labor problem. The framework, meant to circumvent any loopholes present in the ILO's worst forms of child labor convention, and, according to a 2010 paper by Benjamin and Lawrence, being heavily based upon issues in the cocoa industry. And the results of said initiatives? A worse overall situation that has seen Ghana drop from a Tier 1 rating in the anti-trafficking report to a Tier 2. Which may seem to be a little bit paradoxical. I mean, how is it that the situation is worsening when harsher frameworks are being put in place to combat it? Well, the short answer to that question, because life is complicated. So just imagine this, right? Sammy is a 12-year-old boy, born and raised within a poor family in the Ghanaian region of Volta, famous for its cocoa production. And when Sammy grows up, he wants to become a doctor. His escape route from the prison, that is a life of poverty. And it's going to be a hard path, but Sammy's a bright kid and everyone knows that eventually he can do it. But times are tough right now. Both his mom and his dad work long hours extracting cocoa for some European company that makes billions, whilst they barely have enough to put food on the table, sometimes even going hungry themselves, so little Sammy can eat. But it's just too much, and they just don't have enough money, which leaves them with a dilemma. I mean, social services in Ghana are just not what they are in Europe, in part due to governance issues, no doubt, but also attributable to the limited economic capacities at the country's disposal, in part due to its history as a colonized nation that saw it pillaged from a litany of resources. But regardless of the reasons, Sammy's parents, through no fault of their own, are left with a dilemma. Either tell Sammy that they can no longer afford to buy him books, or that he has to begin working himself so as to continue his studies. A tragic choice to be hoisted with, no doubt, but Sammy's a pragmatic kid. In these regions, you really have no choice but to be. And so he accepts, trusting that his parents will do everything in their power to make sure that he retains the necessary time for his studies, meaning that his dream is still very much alive. And so he begins, working as a child laborer within the vaulting cocoa industry, not hired directly by the multinational conglomerate that his parents work for, but instead through local intermediary companies less risk-averse to getting caught up in child labor scandals, and that in turn sell their yield to said massive corporation. And so, this becomes Sammy's new normal, until some Western broadcasting network takes an interest in the issue of child labor within the cocoa industry in Volta, and in turn releases a hard-hitting documentary about the subject. Said documentary spurring a series of child advocacy groups to pressure the Ghanaian government to take action, which in turn triggers the government to utilize the 2005 Human Trafficking Act to completely crack down on the intermediary groups that Sammy works for, and of course for the most part leaving the multinational company untouched. And with that, the government claims victory as child traffickers are put behind bars. But where does that leave Sammy? Well, with no job, no money, and no prospects. You see, because the government only tackled the problem from the sensationalistic criminal child labor perspective, this essentially leaves Sammy's parents without enough income to fund his studies, thus leading Sammy to fall behind until his medical dream completely falls out of his reach, thus dooming him to the exact same future as his parents. Picking cocoa for some exploitative company for the rest of his life, and his future children likely to repeat the same vicious cycle from their end. So what exactly is the moral of Sammy's story? Well, as Samuel Okiera puts it in his seminal article, Shock and Awe, a critique of the Ghana-centric child trafficking discourse, any sort of child labor initiative that doesn't take into account structures of inequality is doomed to failure. Something that hysteria-based campaigns based on issues in the cocoa industry are bound to fail at due to their overly simplistic nature. But this of course begs the question, what is to be done to remedy the issue then? Well, recent research seems to suggest that, counterintuitive as it may seem, ending this abolitionist attitude towards child labor can do a lot of good, which isn't to say either that child advocacy groups are obsolete or that the dream to end child labor should be cast away, but instead to highlight the need for the narrative to shift away from anti-trafficking frameworks and more into the direction of social care and labor rights. In turn, broadening the focus of the discourse beyond sexy industries such as cocoa. A 2012 paper by Roy McConaughey and Gavin Hilson, for example, discusses the issue of child labor within the artisanal gold mining industry of Sierra Leone's Kono district, subject to many of the same problematic abolitionist attitudes of cocoa, but with the exception of garnering less interest, with the interviews of this study highlighting true stories very similar to that of Sammy, as children working within post-war Sierra Leone often view work as an opportunity for social mobility and extra income for education, and often receiving relatively fair pay for their work and entering of their own accord, albeit due to economic circumstances outside of their control. One child, for example, stating, "Life is very hard here. My father was a carpenter, but he can't work because he injured himself. My sisters are too small to come to the mine. We do not have a farm, so the money I earn with my mother mining gold is important for the family. My father doesn't like us being here, but without the income from mining, life would be very difficult." Another, "If I am not able to learn, I will not be able to get a job and I will suffer. Gold mining is paying for my school. I want to be a nurse and mining is providing me with the means of getting an education and pursuing a better life." With similar stories prevalent in other industries such as garments within Southern Asia, coffee within South and Central America, as well as a series of problems within the West that is anything but free of skeletons in this regard. However, if there's one common thread that can be gleaned from all stories, it is that of poverty, the true enemy that needs to be dealt with should we hope to eventually solve this issue. And that's essentially what lies at the heart of the matter. Because whilst an evil child trafficker kidnapping children and forcing them to work for the sake of Nestlé's profit provides a very compelling narrative, it far from tells the full story, providing a very compelling, alluring, and simplistic narrative with an equally simple solution. Just arrest the bad man and now the good child can be happy. Playing catch in the sun sunshine without a care in the world. Which is undoubtedly a very alluring narrative, since it essentially negates the need to delve into the historical and structural factors as to why some countries are more poor than others, and in turn alleviating many of the important players who may have the ability to do something about this issue from the moral necessity to do so. Or, as Lawrence puts it, upon closer examination, the shift from exploitative labor to child trafficking reflects a larger shift among political elites, away from ambitious social reform agendas and towards narrower, neoliberal validation of legitimate propriety and employment rights, juxtaposed with illegitimate labor. But again, this begs the question, what is to be done to remedy child labor then? Well, as I already alluded to, the answer to that question is, well, complicated, because it essentially requires a massive restructuring of our entire political and economic system, something that one person is certainly not qualified to do. Instead, therefore, we will discuss initiatives proposed by researchers which, whilst less ambitious in their scope, can nonetheless do a lot of good. And the optimal method for doing so would of course be to strengthen social services so as to not leave children with no other choice but to work. Something that, as we already alluded to, poorer countries may not necessarily be able to do due to their limited economic prowess, which may in turn signify the important role that foreign aid can play in all of this. Ironically, however, certain research seems to suggest that aid provided by certain entities such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and others can sometimes come at the detriment of child laborers, as said funds are often provided but only with a series of strings attached, strings that tend to necessitate the reduction of state spending, and often as a result, resulting in the defunding of the pivotal social care institutions that are so pivotal in the fight against child labor. Or as the NGO ActionAid puts it, in reference to IMF funding of Ghana, stability has been achieved against the backdrop of high unemployment, poverty, and increased inequality. IMF policies have thus not contributed to shared growth and income redistribution in Ghana. The IMF required the government of Ghana to reduce spending on health, education, and development. In effect, the IMF demands the poor in Ghana to have a lower standard of living. This issue perfectly encapsulating just how important it is to challenge the highly Western ethnocentric notions of child labor, notions that often act as a smokescreen for the true issue at hand: poverty and economic inequality. So what do you think? Would challenging these frameworks alone be enough to solve this issue? Or should a more robust method be utilized to deal with one of the primary issues of our time? I'd really like to know what you think in the comments, so please feel free to comment below. And whilst you're there, why not like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be alerted of future videos?